I was, just in case you didn't know. My name is Matt Turi. I'm the manuscript research librarian here. And a part of my duties, and probably the favorite part of my duties, is actually helping coordinate the fellowship program. As you know, because many of you were here last night, this symposium really represents the conclusion of of a grant that's funded for about 5 years, a large number of research residencies here in Wilson Library. The grant was provided by by the Watson Brown Foundation, and we're extraordinarily grateful for the funds that they had given to us. I was thinking about what we wanted this fellowship to be, and I had something that sounded very much like what we wrote in the grant. We want to form, a community. But really, what we really wanted to have happen was something a lot like this. We wanted people who engaged with our collections to talk with us, to be a part really of not an archival smash and grab, right? The sort of you come, you're here, you leave, and we really never know quite what happens. So we've had a chance, an opportunity in the last 5 years to work with you in a very different way. And that's been really gratifying. And I think it's improved both the scholarship that's come out of your work here, but it's immensely improved our understanding of both what researchers want and the nature of our collections themselves. We do profoundly different things. My colleague Laura Hart always used to say we're in the advertising business. We basically say just enough to make you think it's relevant, and then you do the hard work of figuring out how that relevancy plays out. Just a few sort of demographics about the fellowship program. As Maria alluded to last night, we've had in the last 5 years 57 residents here. And of those, they sort of break down to 27 who are conducting exploratory research to develop their prospectus, and another 30 who are deep into their sort of doctoral research. When I was walking the dog this morning, I didn't crunch the numbers, of course. Minimally, that means that people were here for 57 months. That's, because everybody was here for either a month or for up to 3 months. So that's a considerable amount of time. And that represents a very different model than the one that we normally see. So non-resident graduate students, when we see them, it's usually for 2-3 days, maybe a week, if we see them at all. Alternatively, it really be some sort of research request. And what that would mean is that they would ask for something obvious. They would ask for something that was cited, that was embedded in the historiography, or they would ask for something that was explicitly identified in a very discreet way that sort of just made it obvious for them. And the great value of being here for that sort of time is that you can pursue the non-obvious, right? You can sort of wander the archives with us. And I do mean that just metaphorically. The stacks are closed. Also, I'd like to just say at this point a few things about the people that made this possible. So the symposium was the result of an awful lot of hard work for people that I'm deeply grateful for. Quite honestly, if I had been left to my own devices, we'd be sitting on the steps outside and I would be pointing towards the campus Y and saying that's where the coffee is. So this is really, really nice. It began with the selection of papers and organization of panels, the discussions that we could call in, who would be a relevant and appropriate keynote. And all of this was best decided not by one person, but by a committee of really dissimilar minds, right, with different sorts of points of views that could come together with something that would be really interesting. And to that end, I'd really like to say thank you to Professor Antoine Hunter of the History Department, Professor Seth Koch of American Studies, Shatra Powell, curator of the Southern Historical Collection, Steve Weiss, curator of the Southern Folklife Collection, and Jason Tomberlin, who is my boss, and that's not why I'm thanking him, who is the head of research and instruction, as well as the interim North Carolina curator. Also, and just in terms of today, and sort of all of this planning, my colleagues, Allison Barnett, Nadia Clifton, Katie Fanfani, and Liz Ott really did the work of making this happen, getting this organized, knowing what questions to ask and who to go to. And then finally, I'd just like to thank our co-sponsors, the Southern Oral History Program and the Center for the American South. The other thing I'd like to talk about just briefly, the fellowship program more broadly. intensive archival research just doesn't happen, right? It sort of reminds me of a colleague that I had years ago who was brash, and he was spelling his name to a researcher um, because he assumed that he was going to be in the acknowledgments. And the researcher was confused, to which he replied, these boxes don't page themselves. And they don't. So there's an awful lot of work that goes on that's not excellent, sort of evident. So the people that describe collections, the people that curate collections, the people that digitize, the people that think deeply about these materials and make them accessible to scholars is what really made this fellowship program work. I guess a final thought is, today I think we're going to be engaged what in a shorthand and maybe a little bit of too cute remark is hard history. So we're going to be talking about things that are painful and that are important when we think about who we are and who we might become. So it reminds us of the importance of these collections and doing that work. And one thing that you may have heard, and this is something that we as an institution are anxious to speak with you about, is to be good stewards, to make sure that these collections survive as far into the future as possible. We're embarking next fall on a major renovation project that's going to significantly impact access to our collections for a period of 2 to 3 years. What I would encourage you to do is to talk to us. Talk to us as soon as you can, not because I can promise you anything, but because if we don't understand your needs, we don't really know what the possibilities are during that period. So take that with you back to your departments, to other like-minded scholars, and really cause an avalanche of email so that we can start figuring this out together. All right, so today's first panel, really excited about, is going to be discussed by, or the discussant is going to be Boakyewa-Ansah, who's a historian of US history, and really in a lot of ways represents the goal of this program. When I look at her biography, she was also a fellow here. And oddly, she's got her master's degree in Edinburgh under David Silkenet, who, and I mean this in a good way, is known to staff, right? So David is really archivally inclined, and he sent a number of students to us. And really what we want to do is have you do the same. So it's this sort of proselytizing moment is what these fellowships are. So Abena is currently at, and I must admit that I was a little bit off because I was thinking she was at Asheville, and this was closer. She's an assistant research professor of history and associate director of the George and Ann Richards Civil War Era Center at Penn State University. And the thing that I'd like to stress is the work that she did here, her first manuscript, was called Freedom Was Their North Star, Formerly Enslaved Women's Efforts to Secure and Define Freedom During the American Civil War. That was really hard work, and I remember we had a lot of discussion. And I think the time that you spent here really did allow you to pursue those non-obvious sources and to sort of correct for so many of the biases that ignore, so many archival biases that ignore the people you were trying to find. So welcome, and really looking forward to your first panel.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you, Matt, for that introduction. Yes, the Wilson Library has been a huge part of my journey. This was the first fellowship I had while researching during graduate studies, and it changed the trajectory of my research, and it showed me what was possible. And I'm really excited to be discussant today and to be introducing these wonderful panelists to you because they're doing similar kind of innovative work that I think is really exciting. So wake up, take a sip of coffee, and get ready to engage and listen to these wonderful, wonderful papers. Just kind of an introduction to how this is going to go. I will introduce the panelists one by one so that if anybody's late, they can know who's speaking and what's happening. And then from there, we will, once we've done all three, we will get up onto the stage after the screen has gone up. And I will have a couple of opening remarks about, just things that we could discuss, some ideas, and then we'll open the floor to Q&A. So I'm hoping it'll be pretty conversational. I won't say too much. I would just love to hear more from our panelists. So with that, let's dive in. Our first paper today comes from Dr. Ina Dixon, and she received her PhD in American Studies from UNC-Chapel Hill in 2021. She is now a public historian and works as a historic consultant through her company named Storied Capital, which is based in Danville, Virginia. Her paper, Storied Capital, Urban Revitalization and Reckoning with the Remembered Past, explores how a former mill town in Danville is being transformed through major economic developments and the role of the past in that transformation. Let's welcome Dr. Ina Dixon.
Thank you so much, Abena. Really appreciate that. And thank you, Wilson Library. It's so good to be back here. I've been here often this fall, and I'm coming back to the archives on Thursday, so it's helpful that this conference is happening. Today, I'd just like to talk to you. First of all, can you guys hear me okay? Great. I'd just like to talk to you a little bit about the academic endeavor of the PhD, balancing that with a public history program. And I've worked in Danville, Virginia, which is where I'm still working for the past 10 years. And there's a complexity that comes with being an academic in a public realm, that you study history in the archive, and then you have to bring that into focus with understanding how that history is remembered in a community. And then now I'm charged with exhibiting a narrative that blends the two of those in Danville. And how do you do that exhibit without eliding either the papers or the people that can tell the story of a place? And so I'm here to share with you my academic work that was supported through a Wilson Dissertation Fellowship and how that has evolved to be more public facing. And we got the slides up. Let me see if I can. That's not working. Oh. There we go. Thank you. Okay, I see the green light now. All right, so this is Danville, Virginia, known for tobacco and textiles, much like many of the places around here in North Carolina. So it's a unique story in the state of Virginia that's really known for tobacco and sort of, the mother of presidents, that sort of nonsense. But there's a evolution that's happened recently due to the real demands of change that will alter a community in Danville that I've been working in since 2014 in a Danville Regional Foundation fellowship that I was charged with building a narrative that would take Danville beyond not only a black and white narrative, but also one that went beyond the economics that had shaped the history and that are now, as so often is the case in other cities in the United States, completely gone. So my current work is attempting to meet the needs of a past, present, and future of this community to not only preserve and steward the past and its myriad of stories, but also to contextualize public memory with a more nuanced historical framework, a framework that hopefully addresses how place, capital, and race intertwine to shape communities for good and ill. The story begins with my academic work here at UNC-Chapel Hill. My dissertation explored a segregated world in Danville, and especially how the city's textile industry, dominated by the company Dan River Mills, whose company archives are here housed at Wilson in the Southern Historical Collection, how Dan River Mills explicitly committed to hiring and uplifting an exclusively white workforce for the majority of its economic life. Dan River Mills began in Danville in 1882, founded by a group of local Southern white merchants who were, quote, not only interested in developing the water power, unquote, from the nearby Dan River, but also, according to one of the founders, Robert Addison Schofield, were anxious to bring white labor to Danville to break the Negro rule, unquote, that had existed in the city government. The city at that time was a Black majority city. There was a Black mayor, head of the market was Black, and a number of the police force were Black as well. And it was ruled by a biracial political coalition known as the Readjuster Party, which was a progressive party in Danville at that time. And that really irked these local white men. These men's anxiety over losing the racial hierarchy their forefathers had enjoyed during the system of slavery gave birth to an industry, at least in the microcosm of Danville, that would be dedicated for most of its life to upholding whiteness of deserving of social and economic privilege. And here, so the last slide shows you, these are the three founders. There's three brothers, the Schoolfield brothers, along with three other men who founded the mills. Robert Addison is one of them. Of course, he tells you explicitly why they brought textiles to Danville, where there were no textiles before, it's just tobacco. And then this is his brother, J.E. Schoolfield, who signed something that incited the Danville Race Riot in 1883, merely 18 months after Dan River Mills was founded. And this circular decried the readjuster party rule, decried what they saw as the oppression of white people in Danville. And after the riot, the founder of Dan River Mills, Robert Addison Schoolfield, and later President Dan River Mills, himself patrolled the streets of Danville on the election day following that riot in 1883, and patrolled it, making sure that no Black people would vote. I think 31 of 1,300 Black voters in 1883 ended up voting that year because of the race riot. So that being said, there's no question that the demographics of Danville changed from the 1880s until the 2000s, nearly the entire economic life of Dan River Mills, due to these first founding principles. Economics and industry shape the landscape, and they shape our cities. So Dan River Mills began, they didn't have enough white people in Danville because it's a Black majority town to work in these textile firms. So they recruited them from the southwestern parts of the state, also rural farms from North Carolina. And so their anxiety about what white people would get to do and the oppression of white people, which was not true, really held a tight grip on this community in Danville for a long time. And I don't think this trend is a coincidence. So my dissertation, to showcase the dual purpose of ostensibly purely economic enterprises like Dan River Mills, I centered the built environment of Dan River Mills mill village of Schoolfield. And that's right, it was right outside of Danville. Now it's a neighborhood of Danville. And I analyzed the village's development from 1903 to 1931, not merely as a built environment, but also looking at these buildings as sort of monuments, everyday monuments created to sustain a system of segregation for decades. Dan River could make sure that they could only hire white people to work in the textile mills, and to live in this mill village, you had to work at the textile mill. So you were creating basically a white suburb in Danville in 1903. So far before when we think those started. Today, the built environment of Schoolfield Mill Village is radically changing in a way I couldn't have anticipated when I started working there in 2014. When I started working there in 2014, this is what Schoolfield looked like. So 82 acres of mills gone. City took down all the mills after the 2006 demise of Dan River Mills and all their other properties. So all the things you think of that come with a mill village, the company store, welfare building, and other office buildings were sold off to the lowest bidder, and were at best neglected, but at worst destroyed. So the built environment and the central driver of the community were almost completely destroyed, and the memories of those who had lived and worked there were at risk too. One Schoolfielder told me that all that was left of Schoolfield was a, quote, dead pile of bricks. So she humanized this process. In 2018, my now husband, then a developer who was just trying to get interested in this neighborhood, he specializes in historic rehab projects, but mostly in Roanoke, Virginia. But he purchased what was left of Dan River offices and community buildings, including the Schoolfield Museum, which was run out of Dan River's welfare office. And this museum was started in 2011 by dedicated Schoolfielders, of course, all white, because that's who lived there at that time. And by 2019, it was running out of funding and volunteers. And he also bought some commercial buildings, including company store, a weird 1950s bank building, and former executive office buildings. These are all around the mill site, and they're basically in the same sort of area. In 2019, well, we also told the Schoolfield Museum they had artifacts and Okay, they had artifacts and a big collection. The whole company archives of Dan River Mills was housed in an attic in the museum. So we got that donated here to Wilson to the Southern Historical Collection, and then we stored the rest of their artifacts so that we could re-showcase it and recurate it in the revitalized buildings that we had now owned. In 2020, the city helped support our small efforts to refocus revitalizations in Schoolfield by funding $1 million community engaged master planning process. So really engaging community members. They had lots of like goofy community events where, you know, this is a Halloween, so that's why Where's Waldo's in there. But really got a lot of community feedback, and that's really the best way to do one of these plans. They also hired me in 2020 with my company to survey properties and write the historical narrative that would designate Schoolfield as a historic district on the National Register, which it had not been yet. The designation of a historic district established Schoolfield's historical significance as a state and national level. It's an honorary designation, but it also encourages private development in that any qualifying buildings can then be purchased by private developers and they can be redeveloped. And the state government and the federal government will offer about 40% of the rehabilitation costs back to the developer. Otherwise, these buildings would not get done. Frankly, they're just too expensive. The terracotta tile on one of these buildings costs $800,000 to replace. So without the historic tax credit program, without this designation, these buildings do not get revitalized. And this is a vital component of any revitalization process, and we needed this in Schoolfield to attract other community-minded developers to the area who would revitalize through historic rehabilitation. That did not happen. The anchor tenant for Schoolfield on the former mill site, and you'll see the landmark of those smokestacks, ended up not being that kind of community-minded developer at all. It's Caesars Entertainment, like Las Vegas, and there's a resort going on the former 82-acre Dan River Mill site in Schoolfield. They have really worked with the city and the community, I will say, but they were not the sort of small town developer we thought would come in. And the project is set to open in late 2024, 500-room hotel, a spa, pool, bars, restaurants, 2,500 seat theater, and meeting and convention space. It's going to change the game, and it's happening. I mean, here's a live cam footage of what it looks like right now on the site. And so Schoolfield is, needless to say, on the cusp of radical change with this new anchor tenant. A commitment to showcase Schoolfield history, which we had promised the Schoolfield Museum when we bought their building in 2019, must now be balanced with the master plan of the city, the community engagement there, the economic and social consequence of a casino in the middle of a former mill village where there are, you know, some 800 houses are still surrounding it, and the racial and economic legacy of Dan River Mills. However, the fact that we had secured key properties in Schoolfield would help in keeping that commitment to not letting Schoolfield's history be lost. I have no doubt that if the casino had those properties, they would be gone. Okay, got it. I can do that. Our commitment to showcase what Schoolfield has to be balanced with two very different narratives of what it actually was. One narrative is derived from those of the Schoolfield Museum, the warm memories of white men and women who saw Schoolfield as a tight-knit community. And one that is derived from the archives here at Wilson that exposes Dan River executives' commitment to the company's founding to exclude Black men and women from the uplift white workers benefited from the mills. Schoolfield Museum, for instance, had been a labor of love, an attempt to save the memory of the Schoolfield community before it had so drastically changed. Unintentionally, as a passionate outsider historians, as public historian Benjamin Filing might term them, the Schoolfield Museum had saved and honored artifacts belonging to a segregated world, reiterating the exclusion of Blackness that had been the goal of segregation and fundamental to Dan River Mills. And even in published narratives that elided Blackness completely from the historic story. And even in oral histories collected from Dan River workers, both by the Southern Oral History Program here at Chapel Hill, although that's a great archive, and by local Danville history professors in 1984, did not include a single Black voice. By repeating the whiteness the mills had created, these narratives supported a history of Dan River and Schoolfield's development as simply a byproduct of segregation rather than a vehicle for its normalization. As a casino comes in and other new develops, we need to really think about critically how we document this moment of change, how we document the past to influence the present and the memory of what Dan River Mills was. So recently I got funding from the Virginia Humanities as a public humanities fellow to dive back into the archive, complete the story of Dan River Mills. I mean, my dissertation only went up to 1931, so I got to go up to 2006 now. So I'm finding lots of really neat stuff in the archives that makes this more representative of a story. There's a lot of underseen, underknown things about Dan River. I mean, the people that worked there, who was working in the kitchen, you know, before Dan River Mills integrated their workforce in the 70s. And then how do you explain their international expansion in the 1960s, which included places like Jamaica, where Dan River women were wearing fabrics that they couldn't have made if they were in Danville. So I will skip over things. And so this is really important to have these documents in this narrative, because Schoolfield is now 61% Black, which was not the case when it was Mill Village from 1903 to 1951. And the overarching goal of this fellowship, and I'll just show you slides from sort of vision boards and things like that we've been working on, is to develop a physical and digital exhibit that will be housed in the revitalized buildings of Dan River that we own around the casino now, that were once landmarks of Schoolfield Village. And the contextual narrative will be blended with memories, stories, and artifacts of those who lived and worked at the company. And most of those things will be on loan from the Schoolfield Museum, as well as derived from the Wilson Library and the archive here. Okay, almost done. So in order to display a multifaceted narrative, my work will also have to be multifaceted as I look to include a more racially and experientially diverse. Here's an example of what I'm looking at for the digital exhibit. I'm attempting to hold a history harvest and interviews. Here are some folks that I've interviewed, as well as some other graduate students from UNC, just to blend in the narrative, not over generationally, but also racially, to see about broadening this history. And I'm determined to build more relationships like this. I've been holding history harvest events, which almost have nothing to do with history, quite frankly. I sit there and I have a little booth, but there's also beer and a bouncy house, and it's free for the community. And I do this every month in Schoolfield. But that's the way I get names. And so now I have a list of names of people who are interested in telling me their story. And they know that, you know, the girl who offers free beer must be, you know, fun to talk to. So I've just begun this work, and I look forward to sharing more of it as the exhibits develop over this winter, along with the development of these projects that we have in Danville, in Schoolfield. What ultimately drives this work is a commitment to a more inclusive narrative and a dedication to the stewardship of complex community memory within a historical context. This process of developing an exhibit, engaging with the public, continuing to conduct traditional research, like I will be in the library on Friday, will all get particularly messy at some point, as most public projects often do. You should see the vitriol on Facebook about my exhibit and how I'm tying Dan River to racism, but that's all right. However, I hope to develop something that sparks curiosity and invites public reflection on the ways industry and race etch the built environment, as much as our lived experience to create communities past, present, and future. Thank you.
Thank you, Ina. Next up, we have Hampton. And Hampton Smith is a doctoral candidate at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology's History, Theory, and Criticism of Art and Architecture program. His research focuses on the art, material culture, and architecture of the transatlantic world from 1600 to the present, particularly as they relate to histories of race, technology, and the environment. They're working on a dissertation tentatively titled Making Against Slavery, Craft and Abolition in the Black Atlantic World from 1750 to 1865. They also have forthcoming articles that will appear in American Art and the Journal 18. Is that correct? Journal 18. He recently edited and published Threshold 51, Heat, MIT's Architecture's peer-reviewed journal. And Hampton's paper today is entitled The Misperception of Black Skill, Tools as Weapons in Slave Revolts. Welcome, Hampton.
All right, it's great to be back as an alum of 2019. Always a good day to be a Tar Heel. And we are tight on time, so I'm gonna get started. This is the misperception of Black skill, tools as weapons in slave revolts. Sometime during the spring of 1800, enslaved tobacco cutters within Henrico County, Virginia, began bringing their scythes to one of Brookfield Plantation's blacksmiths, Solomon Prosser, under the guise that their blades were in need of sharpening. Instead, Solomon grabbed a pair of tongs to warm the blade atop charcoal, and then, using a chisel, Solomon cut a line down the blade's center until it was completely divided into two. Solomon's brother and carpenter, Gabriel, then began to attach hand-carved wooden handles to the blades, retrofitting the scythe into two cutlasses for a planned insurrection now known as Gabriel's Rebellion, set to take place on Saturday, August 30th, 1800 at midnight. This act of making tools into weapons, or tools into other tools that could be weapons, ultimately served as one linchpin for white Virginians to sentence 35 enslaved people to be executed for a conspiracy. It was not only the stealing of property, but the unseen act of, quote, furnishing weapons that became evidence worthy of a death sentence. Despite their failure to enact wide-scale revolutionary change, enslaved craftspeople's rerouting of artisanal knowledge towards insurgents nevertheless delivered a powerful message to their slave owners, that their enslaved craftspeople of color might just dismantle their houses using their tools. Making tools into weapons was therefore an act that resisted existing labor conditions while enacting a future-oriented and resoundingly collective practice within the plantation economy. The artisanal knowledge behind the act of turning tools into weapons has been underthought in histories of Gabriel's rebellion. Instead, the plausibility of revolt, and Gabriel's leadership in particular, is explained through his occupational status and subsequently his liberal individualism. For these reasons, Gabriel, rather than Solomon and the many other artisans involved in the making of tools and weapons, have become inseparable from the revolt's historicization. Similar to how the subsequent Denmark-Vesey's conspiracy in South Carolina and Nat Turner's rebellion in Virginia were named after their carpenter ringleaders, Gabriel's occupation has helped historians situate his liberal subjectivity within a larger project of individualist abolition. This mode of historicization has meant the actual skills and techniques of craftspeople, like Solomon, have rarely been considered relevant to histories of Black radicalism across the Atlantic world. In order to address this gap, this talk analyzes acts that could be affected by those with a practical knowledge of making as a kind of insurgent making, a practice that enacts revolt through the skilled manipulation of materials. The enslaved toolmakers that frame this talk were usually not capable of, and potentially not interested in, developing strategies of resistance into textual or visual arguments. Therefore, I argue we must turn to the formal conventions of toolmaking, its materiality, its collaborative conditions of production, and its inborn capacity for futurity to fully see the vast network of interconnected Black artisans committed to transforming the tools of their trade into the tools of their unknown freedom. The rest of my talk is divided into two parts. The first considers how enslaved toolmakers manipulated the visuality of their enslavers by making weapons disguised as tools in plain sight. And the second, very briefly, explores the meaning embedded in making iron cutlasses. Printed within the 1840 edition of the American Anti-Slavery Society's Almanac is a woodblock illustration entitled, "They Can't Take Care of Themselves." Part of an abolitionist print media campaign, the engraving and corresponding text narrates the illogic behind the white perception of Black skill under enslavement. A group of enslaved craftspeople are foregrounded, choreographed to highlight how each skillfully wields their tool. One digs, two strike an iron bar atop an anvil, another whittles wood. So engaged in their work, they do not notice that they are being surveilled by a white couple in the background. Staring directly at the Black craftspeople before them, the couple cannot help but judge. Quote, "Poor things, they can't take care of themselves." Here, attention is drawn to the couple's blindness to what otherwise seems obvious. The display of artisanal skill, and specifically Black skill, does not register for the couple. Viewers like us are meant to understand the couple's misperception as illogical. Black skill, so abolitionists want to illustrate, undoubtedly exists. This the couple surely knows. Nevertheless, they remain unable or unwilling to acknowledge its presence without slavery. In other words, Black skill only becomes perceptible for the white couple within slavery's peculiar condition of vision, labor, and exploitation. The symbiotic relationship between the economic system of slavery and the pro-slavery sensorium made it impossible to sense a Black praxis of care grounded through the ownership of artisanal skill. By mocking slave owners' misperception, the almanac image suggests that enslavement depends upon the disavowal of Black skill's centrality to the American economy, and therefore an inability to perceive Black skills inherently collective, and as I want to suggest today, its potentially insurgent character. For if the sensorium was unwilling to detect the sociality of Black skilled labor, amply visible in the rhythmic synchronic unison between the 5 craftspeople we see, then it was often unable or unwilling to detect the possibility of how that communally skilled labor might actually bolster a slave revolt. To return to our opening example, Gabriel and Solomon's insurgent making was not intelligible for whites until 2 enslaved Black individuals told their owner of the larger plan. Not until information was rendered logocentrically were whites able to perceive the possibility of a collective revolt. Like the couple in They Can't Take Care of Themselves, pro-slavery whites were unable to perceive that the act of skillfully making a tool could also be an act to conspire. That it was only after white Virginians knew of the rebellion's existence that they ascribed political motivation to the act of making only further underscores how tools, in the eyes of slavery's apologists, were not always seen as weapons. Neither was Gabriel's rebellion an isolated event. In the case of Denmark Vesey's conspiracy, a thwarted plot led by a freed Black carpenter within Charleston, South Carolina in 1822, 6 poles were found. In the courtroom, these poles subsequently became evidence that an innumerable number of spears were made, despite not having physical evidence of the spearheads. Based on witness testimony, the infamous official report notes, quote, "A slave who was a blacksmith and had been accustomed to making edged tools was employed to make pike heads to be fixed at the end of these long poles." Notice how the possession of skill becomes evidence of insurgent action. Being accustomed to a certain kind of task meant one was potentially culpable of making an innumerable number of spears. Only after a slave revolt was known were pro-slavery whites able to ascribe insurgent character to Black skill. Otherwise, it looked like everyday labor the enslavers needed. Despite this risk, enslaved peoples constantly manipulated their enslavers' misperception by making tools in plain sight of their masters. Tools like Solomon's scythe and cutlass were useful for insurgent making due to their conditional status as tools. Solomon's cutlasses were likely not aesthetically unique, nor were they innovative in design. Their banality, however, was strategically important. Yet, the act of actually making these cutlasses was also a space wherein ideas of insurgency and change were born. That is, the very actions of making tools into weapons amplifies and mirrors the calibration of disparate individual entities into new forms of collective ideological relation, precisely the formula necessary for revolt. Now that we understand that making in plain sight could be a strategic act of resistance, I want to suggest that the basic physical operations of making tools also intimately linked enslaved communities, their skills, and their environments into an insurgent formation. Solomon's cutlasses draw on a broad range of interconnected acts of metamorphosis. For starters, the ability to wrought iron largely stems from its crystalline lattice-like structure, which allows iron atoms to bond strongly in the face of deformation. Iron's transformative potential, however, also afforded its seemingly limitless application across slavery's economy. For example, the iron currency used to transform Africans into slaves could be repurposed into shackles that would then transform into decorative collars, and that would then transform into other devices for torture and the creation of capital. It is perhaps this predicament surrounding ironwork, its potential to be a decorative, useful, and violent medium, that led Toni Morrison in her 2004 novel Beloved to describe protagonist Sethi's scars from her enslavement, quote, like the decorative work of an ironsmith too passionate for display. Yet, iron's metamorphic potential was also harnessed by Black artisans to destabilize its role in bolstering slavery's logistics and severing of Black kinship ties. Let's observe how making an iron tool is always a recursive encounter due to the role of previously wrought tools in the process of making new forms. In the they can't take care of themselves image, we see the extraction, smithing, and finishing process of making an object, possibly even a tool. But every single technique on display is made possible through previously wrought tools. Unlike other forms of making, which often require a tool of a different material, like a brush, to make an object like a painting, blacksmithing stages a recursive encounter with the tools of its making. So if blacksmithing was always a recursive endeavor, then Solomon and other enslaved toolmakers were surely aware of how making tools entailed collectivity at the level of material and technique. Materially, we should note that the cutlass's iron used in Gabriel's revolt was likely mined and refined by other enslaved people at a place like Mr. Ross's ironwork. The charcoal for refining said iron ore was likely made from trees forcibly chopped by enslaved flayers elsewhere in Virginia. And potentially, the coal used by Solomon to heat the scythe in the forge was from the Tuckahoe coal pits. These spaces, as we know from the trial testimony of one insurgent from Gabriel's revolt, were the precise locations wherein Gabriel built a coalition of insurgent Black individuals. In other words, the supply chains and the ecological networks behind transforming a scythe into a cutlass were a blueprint for the very social network Solomon and others aimed to craft. Beyond these material networks, Solomon surely had a striker or hammerman that worked with him at the anvil. This process is represented in this image. Notice how not one, but two individuals are working. While one strikes down, the other holds the piece of metal in place with tongs. The striker was in charge of applying the correctly calibrated amount of force at the same angle and in the exact position. As many contemporary blacksmiths underscore, this relies upon a shared, intimate choreography of synchronic movement. These interchanges are made possible through the rhythmic unity between striker and smith, texturing and giving rise to an intimate form of affiliation or process of feeling and feeling for, to borrow from Omakeze Tinsley, as a viable strategy for belonging to one another, the environment, and to history's unfolding. In the case of turning a scythe into a cutlass, the smithing process mirrored the larger act it sought to bolster, a collective unified endeavor towards an unknown future. Even though their acts of insurgent making did not lead to the revolt they imagined, the toolmakers involved in Gabriel's rebellion skillfully and collectively made tools into weapons to support transformative change. Thank you.
Thank you, Hampton. Okay, last but not least, we're staying in the 19th century with Nicole Viglini. Nicole is a postdoctoral student at the Richards Center at Penn State, where I am also, so we know one another. Her current project explores how antebellum Southern women leveraged their property and networks to gain financial credibility in a slave society. Nicole's paper today is entitled, "She Has Many Connections in This Place, Enslaved Women's Geographic Knowledge and Gendered Credit Networks in the Rural South." Please welcome Nicole.
Hi, everyone. So wonderful to be here today back at the Wilson Library, where this project really took root, and I was able to draw on so many fantastic collections to advance my thesis. Let's see. I'll get right started. Ali Antigua managed the complicated, busy plantation kitchen at Martha and Thomas Foreman's estate on the eastern shore of Maryland. Born into slavery, Allie prepared hundreds of meals for the Foremans and their guests under Martha's orders and scrutiny. She also sewed and made candles for the household. A close look at the diary that Martha diligently kept for more than 30 years reveals that Allie's domestic labor also necessitated her travel to neighboring households to deliver goods on Martha's behalf. And on one occasion, she gave Allie $2 and permission to go to Chestertown, more than 20 miles away on modern-day roads. A different day, Martha wrote she let Allie go to Baltimore to see her daughter, Henrietta, which was nearly 70 miles away. Martha Foreman's diary suggests that Allie Antigua was familiar with various places outside the bounds of the Foreman's estate, both because Martha commanded it and because Allie had successfully negotiated to travel on her own accord, notwithstanding the dangerous and deeply surveilled terrain she would have to navigate to do so. Allie Antigua's geographic knowledge, as revealed in Martha Foreman's diary, challenges a common misperception that persists in historians' telling of our shared past, that enslaved girls and women living in the rural antebellum South had little firsthand knowledge about their physical surroundings outside the premises of their enslavers. One of the reasons historians have missed the extent of enslaved women's geographic awareness is due to a chronic undervaluing of their labor as skilled labor. Another reason is due to a long-standing belief that white women's economic purview was confined to the household, and that they forfeited their legal identities after marriage. Following women's historians, including Stephanie Jones Rogers and Laura Edwards, I read white women's diaries as financial and legal documents. I thereby demonstrate that enslaved girls and women in the rural South cultivated a deep and expansive knowledge of place outside plantation and household boundaries through daily routines of forced labor and of their own accord. Because their work was instrumental to the Southern economy, and particularly to white women's fortunes, enslaved domestic laborers frequently navigated uncultivated terrains, small rural neighborhoods, and roads into town. I contend that enslaved women's geographic knowledge and skilled domestic labor created a dual landscape that on one hand built social and economic connections that supported the institution of slavery and expanded white women's power, and on the other hand, sometimes enabled enslaved women to create social and economic communities of their own accord, offering a degree of relief from the violent trauma of enslavement. Laws on the books from the colonial era through the antebellum period strictly regulated enslaved people's movement. Beginning in the late 17th century, Virginia's legislators posited a deep connection between Black mobility and insurrection and passed laws that commanded corporal punishment for those in violation. Regular patrols throughout the antebellum South arrested, interrogated, and physically punished any Black individual they found without a pass. Enslaved women were subject to greater degrees of violent retribution if caught than were enslaved men, as historians have rightly shown. Slave owners' written permission passes, like the one pictured here, authorized enslaved people's travel. Those specific forms of dress and certain material objects called tokens also served as cultural and legal indicators of sanctioned mobility into the 19th century. Since women struggled with illiteracy more often than men, these visual and material markers likely played an important role for them. And the frequency with which enslavers sent particular laborers on errands seemed to have provided tacit authorization of their mobility within their local communities. A group of white petitioners complained in an undated petition to the legislature of Mississippi, quote, "Owners of slaves are in the constant practice of sending their domestics, who are generally known to stores and shops for small articles, without taking the trouble to write a permission," end quote. This practice was illegal, though it appears to have been widespread. From a young age, enslaved girls became familiar with neighborhood terrains when their mistresses compelled them to conduct errands on their behalf. Matilda Clifton remembered that her master told his daughter, who was a bride of a few months, that she needed, quote, "a small slave girl to run errands for her." Hattie Hill, who'd been formerly enslaved in Georgia, distinctly recalled her mistress's neighbor because her mistress always sent her there to borrow meal. These tasks continued into their adulthood. Octavia Oddie, a white slave-owning woman of Meridianville, Alabama, often sent two of her slaves, Maria and Parthenia, to conduct a variety of tasks. She wrote in her diary that she sent Maria up to John Pruitt's, a neighbor, with some citron syrup one day. These errands were far from benign tasks. At 8 years old, Rebecca Jane Grant's mistress sent her to a local store to retrieve a package. When she returned, her mistress opened the package to reveal a, quote, "a raw cowhide strap," which she immediately began to whip Rebecca Jane with, because Rebecca Jane had refused to call her mistress's son, who was a toddler, master. Furthermore, daily errands put enslaved girls and women in direct contact with slave traders and the slave market. The letter that Susan, a 16-year-old teenager, delivered to a post office in Virginia contained instructions to a Richmond slave trader to, quote, "please sell her." It appears a similar dynamic was at play in letters that two separate enslaved girls delivered to the notorious slave trader Rice Ballard. Enslavers also charged enslaved domestic laborers with bringing back messages after their errands. Octavia Oddie wrote that she sent Parthenia to Meridian this evening. "She got me a jug of molasses," she wrote, "and cousin Chambers sent me word to send him something to eat." Mary Ann Rebecca Wyke wrote to her daughter that a neighbor hosting a wedding had asked if she could borrow from Wyke, quote, "a good many things, amongst the rest, my maid to wait on the table, so I got all the news," end quote. Rural slave owners charged enslaved women with handling money and making cash transactions on behalf of their enslavers' households. John Holt remembered that his mother used to come and collect $5 in gold for his work every month. At the age of 10, Holt's mistress hired him out to neighboring farmers and planters. It's possible that his mother negotiated with her mistress to conduct this errand, as it would have allowed her to see her son if only once a month. Enslaved women's frequent contact with neighbors could pique slave-owning women's rage, even as their mistresses compelled this work. Octavia Oddie wrote that she whipped Maria for talking about her. Octavia's violence suggests that she believed Maria could potentially pass along information that could prove damaging to her reputation. In addition to becoming aware of the socioeconomic landscapes they navigated daily, enslaved domestic laborers shaped these landscapes. White women coveted enslaved Black women skilled in mobile labor because it augmented their own privileged status. Referring to a woman, Polly, that she purchased, a skilled cook, one Mrs. Whitmore boasted that she, quote, would not be tied herself to the kitchen fire anymore. In the same vein, Sarah Coleman of Louisiana asked her aunt to borrow her enslaved cook, quote, as Mama is quite weakly and the rest of us not very rugged, end quote. It was actually in Coleman's aunt's best interest to loan this unnamed woman to Coleman. Slave-owning women were invested not only in upholding their family status, but also broader political notions of white women's weakness and incapacities. Their shared power was also upheld to rule of law after an 1829 statute passed in North Carolina. Enslavers and hires regularly sent enslaved women to general stores where they purchased small items, spools of thread, yards of fabric, and thimbles. Some transported larger items, most likely necessitating their use of a cart. Account books from a rural general store called Harper's in Lenore, North Carolina, show that enslavers and hires regularly sent enslaved women as proxies to obtain items for their household. Slave owners sent enslaved women to neighboring households and general stores and even larger urban hubs to complete purchases. The same was true, but in reverse, for urban slave-owning women. In 1834, Polly Raines, a white slave-owning woman of French descent who lived in New Orleans, directed Eliza, one of her enslaved domestic servants, to drive a cart to sell various articles in a settlement about 12 miles from the city. During her travels, Eliza would have taken in fragrant water lilies, bananas just coming into fruit. She also would have witnessed enslaved laborers chopping wood in the stifling heat and toiling under the brutal regime of sugar production. Navigating the roadways in an expansive land east to the city, Eliza employed not only her marketing skills, but also her knowledge of a large geographic area to carry out her enslavers' demands. Advertisements for enslaved fugitives suggest that those who took the enormous risk to exit their enslaver service employed their knowledge and networks to do so, and these networks often crossed rural and urban boundaries. In 1840, John Gillespie placed an advertisement in an Alabama newspaper to recover Sally, who had run from his place in Livingston, Alabama. Gillespie told readers that Sally is well known in Mobile and Tuscaloosa and will no doubt endeavor to get to one of those places. Livingston is about 60 miles from Tuscaloosa and more than 150 miles from Mobile on modern roads. Another slave owner placed an ad to recover a woman named Tina, indicating that she was, quote, taken into the country as a nurse for the summer season and that she had many connections. Enslavers certainly tried to demonstrate they were aware of these connections and the locations of family members when they placed these ads. James Ackroyd enticed subscribers to assist him in arresting and returning to him an enslaved woman named Suki. Ackroyd proceeded to list Suki's loved ones and describe where they lived, including her relatives, in various different neighborhoods. But the fact he placed the ad in the first place meant that he evidently did not know the extent of Suki's networks. White women's diaries, the testimony of formerly enslaved individuals, general store records, petitions, and fugitive slave advertisements demonstrate that enslavers, and particularly white women, tasked enslaved domestic laborers with errands that took them outside the bounds of their enslavers' properties. Enslaved women's skilled, mobile, and multifaceted domestic labor enabled white women to expand the parameters of their power. Over the course of their daily forced labor, enslaved women traversed heavily surveilled lands and faced threats of bodily harm. They simultaneously gained a significant degree of knowledge about their physical surroundings, as well as the social, economic, and legal landscapes of their communities. Enslaved women's geographic knowledge challenges previous conceptions that their participation in the networks African Americans developed before freedom was spatially limited to their contributions from within households and behind fence lines. Through everyday errands and enslavers' exploitation of their skills, enslaved women became intimately familiar with the physical and social geographies of their surroundings, and they strove to employ their knowledge and skills to build connections that helped them weather the violent landscape of Southern slavery. Thank you.
Okay, so we're going to move up here once the screen is up and begin our discussion. I just have a couple of opening remarks and then we will start the Q&A session. So do you all want to come up and join me? I'm guessing we need these. Okay, so I would like to start off by thanking each of you for your research. Your work is really, really insightful and kind of pushing the needle on what we're doing in both public history and also in this academic space as well. So these excellent papers, from my perspective, bring new life to things long discussed. Enslaved women's mobility, enslaved resistance, and the curating of memory when history has been written over. Thank you. When history has been written over. Each paper highlights the depths that have yet to be traversed in these topics and sources and begin the process of renewing this type of history. They do what I am always looking for in new scholarship, which is pushing past the question that I think has dominated a lot of African-American history, which is surely questions of agency, what people could and could not do, moves way past that into more creative questions of how essentially African-Americans moved through and navigated the historical environments that they lived in, and as well as how we remember them. While only Hampton uses the term misperception in his talk today, these studies all kind of highlight the centrality of misperception, both in historiography and in public memory, in our interpretations of Black existence, and in both time and space, and also their experiences, as well as how we remember them both publicly and historiographically. Each of these misconceptions lead to a shrinking of Black worlds and capabilities and flatten the three-dimensionality of Black life in the 19th century and the 20th century. It also flattens resistance and Black being. So it pushes me to ask, in correcting these misconceptions and placing African Americans at the center of reimagining these historical moments, what comes into clearer focus for all of you about Black being? As in, what new questions does Black women's antebellum mobility kind of bring to you, Nicole? The enslaved manipulation of visuality and tools into weapons, and the Black heartbeat of Danville and School. Is it Schoolville? Thank you, Schoolville. What do those bring to the fore? All of these papers also really interestingly deal with labor history in a very different way. The history of industry and the history of skill kind of take new form and new life in these papers. And to me, they highlight and contribute an added layer of complexity that kind of reveals this shifting sand of race, the way that race is being formed and how it changes over time. Ira Berlin highlights this kind of understanding of race as a social construct, and we all kind of just nod at that. But what is kind of missing sometimes in our understanding of that is how it is a constantly moving and changing thing. Whiteness is constantly being made and remade. Blackness is constantly being remade and made again and again over time. And this comes really, really clearly to the foreground to me when we put these papers together. In the 19th century, we're looking at this kind of use of industry and skill as a significant part of Black labor. But there's also this kind of ignoring of skill at the same time. It has to be that skill only exists for Black people in the context of enslavement in service to white citizens. Then we shift to the 20th century and we're having kind of the opposite issue of Black laborers actually not being permitted. It's not something that they're able to engage in because it means economic development. And so for me, what I see when I piece these papers together is the way in which whiteness and ideas of whiteness are changing over time, and the same for Black identity as well. So just a couple of questions, well, one for each of you as we begin our discussion. I'm kind of thinking, because I know you're all continuing to develop these works, I'm thinking in terms of how you can develop it further. So Ina, I would love to hear a little bit about where the Black residents end up moving to when they're pushed out by the mill. What happens to them, and then how do they end up coming back? If you know anything about that, and if you could share anything about the oral experience that you've had of collecting these oral histories now. You mentioned a little bit about people's willingness to talk to you or not so willingness to talk to you. And I would love to hear a bit more about that. And then for Hampton, in light of Nicole's paper, I think yours kind of go together really, really nicely. I'm curious whether in your larger project, gender crops up, and in what ways that kind of comes up. I don't know if you've had the chance to read Nikki Taylor's new book, Brooding Over Bloody Revenge, but she talks about the ways in which enslaved women use their skill set and this domestic skill set in order to enact revenge on their enslavers over particular grievances. And then for you, Nicole, of course, you talk about this huge gap between the law and what's actually happening. And I was curious about the flexibility of that. In what ways does that change? I assume in moments after slave revolts, there's a bit more of a clampdown. Is there any kind of change over time or change in particular moments of when the law becomes more lax and when the law becomes more stringent? I would love to hear a little bit about that. Don't have to go into super in-depth answers because we'll take some questions from the audience, but yeah, whoever would like to start.
I can start since you asked first. I think, well, there's a great letter that I found in the Virginia Historic Resources Department about a guy saying, look, Dan River Mills took me off my land in Schoolfield, and they've been mad at me or they were mad at my ancestors ever since one of them participated in the Danville race riot. So, you know, I can't find a lot of other things to sort of contextualize that, but that's an interesting point. And I think the tricky part about Schoolfield is like, yes, most white people lived there, but there were also domestic servants that were living there. The guy who cleaned out the outhouses, I mean, the janitorial positions at Dan River, people cooking the food at this woman's dormitory that later became just like sort of a boarding house. All of these lives were, and all of these Black people were in these white, so-called white spaces. So part of the project is to showcase that. But for the most part, like many Southern cities like Charlotte or Durham or Danville, Black folks lived in other areas. And so working class, I've been working with some people from the nearby Almagro neighborhood, and that's on the same side of the tracks, interestingly enough, as Schoolfield. And so thinking about what are the connections there. And so that's really part of the exhibit. Yeah.
Gender plays a huge role. Within this chapter, you know, blacksmithing is such a, you know, traditionally like male dominated craft. So the way in which women come into this chapter is within the coal pits and working kind of in these places that are surrounding or are the nodes of where these materials are being refined to then become weapons. But I also have been thinking a lot about the kind of homosociality that is present within the blacksmithing forge and thinking about queerness when it comes to those spaces, whether or not that's like queerness as such or more just like queerness in a sense of relating to one another. And then beyond the larger project, Chapter 2 is trying to think about craft skill in relationship to slavery's reproductive economy and thinking about how conceptions of craft skill played out there. So that is the chapter that really focuses on questions of gender, but certainly present throughout. I was recently able to, I discovered a photograph of an enslaved woman who was an assistant to a blacksmith, which I've never heard of before. So it definitely exists. I don't know if it will make its way into this chapter, but certainly there. So yeah.
Thank you so much for that question. So we certainly see an uptick in draconian laws following insurrections, anti-literacy laws, increased surveillance, and increased violence against enslaved African Americans who are more mobile. At the same time, what's really my change over time story kind of follows the economic boom and bust cycles of the Southern economy. Because Polly Raines, for example, one of the women who I had up on the screen from New Orleans, she actually, her economic activities increased. She forced her enslaved marchands, her enslaved market women, to be more mobile after the closure of the Second Bank of the United States and this like kind of ruining of antebellum wealthy merchants. So they're liquidating like all of their market goods at the levee. Polly forces Eliza to go purchase these goods on her behalf, and then forces her to go to the Terre-aux-Boeufs region outside of New Orleans to sell those goods. So, and that's in like, you know, at a time too, that's after Nat Turner's rebellion. So I'm thinking about the ways in which that Eliza is forced to navigate a terrain that's made even more dangerous by these increasingly draconian laws. So, but that's something that I'd really like to continue to think about, how those two change over time stories work together.
Thank you, Nicole. Thank you, all of you. Okay, so we're going to open it up for questions. We have just under 5 minutes for questions from the audience. Seeing a hand there.
That was a wonderful program, all three of you. I'd like to ask Hampton Smith about your fascinating presentation on tools and whether your research might consider the thin line between craft and art, looking at artists like Philip Simmons in Charleston and Dave of the Jar in Georgia, and also the idea of messages of freedom being embedded in slave spirituals and quilts, all of which have connections to what you're doing.
Certainly. I would say that certainly. I think I'm trying to kind of weave together those instances that historians have begun to document with maybe the more banal, right? Like, can we see some of those messages, or can we see some of that thought in a screw? You know, I think we've gone to things in some ways like, you know, Dave in particular, I think offers an example that is kind of because he wrote, we have been able to indoctrinate him into this kind of our text culture, right? But there were many, many people that were making pots that just weren't writing on them. And so to me, like those many, many other people are also really important to historicize, and not just Dave, though Dave is incredible and important and plays a huge role in this dissertation as well. So part of it is trying to blend together these more, I would say, canonical examples of African-American artistic production with the more truly everyday. And I think the way to do that is through the making process itself.
Any other questions for our panelists? We have time for one more.
Thank you all so much. That was a super interesting panel. I have a question for Ina, and I just was wondering if you have reflected on just like the limitations or necessities, or just whatever your thoughts have been on the process of getting, of using the National Historic Registry as a way to like preserve historical memory, and also like pursue ultimately whatever forms of justice that, is the ultimate goal. So I'd love to hear your reflections on that experience.
Yeah, there's tons of limitations. First of all, until recently, I mean, the only thing you need to be on the historic registry is 50 years old. So now that's like, it's going into the 70s and it's like, why? But most of the buildings that have historically been deemed historic are these sort of what you would think of traditional architecture, not really vernacular. And so it was a real push to get even Schoolfield listed, because it's these village houses that are 900 square feet and they're just little that look like mill villages in Luray and Gastonia and all over the place. So that was a push. And these are really an honorary distinction designation, and it doesn't come into play unless you have a developer who's willing and able to go through this historic tax credit process and revitalize these buildings. And I think we need more diversity in that realm, especially so that because Almagro, for instance, where this Black working class neighborhood was in Danville, I mean, that's not a historic district. And it's not a historic district because of two reasons. It's working class and it's Black. And so we need to correct that. And so it can be in this line of revitalization and of care, of stewardship, really. And because revitalization comes with it, gentrification, and that's not quite what we want. But the idea of stewardship and how do we steward a multiple histories. And so I think that the program can really be thought more deeply about in that way, and that we need to diversify those private developers that take advantage of this program.
Okay, I'm going to wrap it up there so that we can have a break. If you do have questions, I'm sure the panelists will be willing to speak with you one-on-one. Thank you. We'll be back in here at 10:30. Let's give them a round of applause.